I hope everybody can hear me. I see that people are still attending here. And we'd like to welcome everybody to the Conexxus monthly webinar, which this month we're featuring the use of NIST Cybersecurity framework to guide your security program. And today our host is Allie Russell. And thank you very much for advancing the next slide. Yep, and so just our agenda today, we'll talk about a few housekeeping items, our presenters, a little bit about Conexxus, and then we'll go straight into the presentation, and we will leave the questions and answers for the end. So just a few housekeeping items. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available in approximately 30 days. It will be featured on YouTube, and you can also find it in the Conexxus website, which is conexxus.org. If you would like a copy of the slide deck, there is a short 3 to 4 question survey at the end of the presentation. If you complete the survey, there will be a link provided, and then the presentation will be emailed to you. A link will be provided so you can go get the presentation. So we do ask participants to ask questions using the webinar panel, and because everybody here is on mute. And then we also ask that there's no vendor-specific questions. Try and keep them as general as possible. So with that, again, I'd like to thank Allie Russell, who is our host from Conexxus. My name is Cara Gunderson. I am the chair of the Conexxus Data Security Standards Committee. My day job, I am the point of sale manager at Citgo Petroleum. And today we're very, very honored to have Chris Leeds and Bob Post, both with Coalfire. And a little bit about Chris here is that he is a principal in the Cyber Risk Advisory Group at Coalfire. He's definitely an asset to the Data Security Committee at Conexxus because he has over 30 years experience in cybersecurity, predictive analytics, and technology, and he's been with Coalfire for 8 years. As I mentioned, he is a long time and a great participant for us in the DSSC, and he advises clients in retail, insurance, banking, and technology. Also with us today, we have Bob Post, and Bob is a CISSP. He's a senior practice director, also in the Cyber Risk Advisory Group at Coalfire. Bob also has 30 years experience in cybersecurity with focus on critical infrastructure protection, emergency preparedness, and operations security. He works with senior leaders on cybersecurity strategy, governance, risk management, and compliance issues. Bob's clients include biotechnology firms, internet media companies, investment firms, and government contractors. Bob is the former CEO and founder of Crossroads Cyber Solutions and is also the former senior vice president of Booz Allen Hamilton. So again, gentlemen, welcome today. We're happy to have you. Just a little bit about Conexxus. Conexxus is an independent, nonprofit, member-driven technology organization and driven mostly by volunteers such as myself, as well as Chris and Bob. Conexxus sets standards for data exchange, security, mobile commerce, and as a merchant, we certainly appreciate the fact that they are setting all those standards so that we don't have to create our own standards specific with each particular point of sale vendor to meet our needs. And it seems to be a really well dovetailed group of folks that we have in Conexxus. We have all of the key players in petroleum. Conexxus also provides vision, and they help identify emerging technology and trends. And as you are mostly well aware, that Conexxus is definitely an advocate for industry, and technology is their policy. So I think we're ready to talk about our webinar schedule. We've had some great webinars here. And in September, we have an impact of bringing your own device and IoT to the workplace. In November, new technologies for addressing payment risk, a survey of payment security landscape, also led by some of the Coalfire members. In December, the EB2B group will be presenting their white paper. And then in January, we have Securing and Pen Testing Your Mobile Payment App by Cigital. In February, we have the Unified Threat Management, What is it and Why it's Important by Omega. And then in March, we're excited because Coal Fire is coming back to us and doing an actual penetration testing and teaching us how to test what matters most. And then Control Scan is going to give us an update on the QIR program, since they're very involved in the PCI, Security Standards Council. Next slide. Don't forget to visit us if you're attending NACS in Chicago, October 17th through the 20th. Conexxus is booth 4384, and Conexxus drives the Tech Edge educational series. If you remember the NACS Tech way back when, the Tech Edge has replaced that now and is during the NACS show. So we hope that you will join us there, and be sure to look at NACS online for all of the educational webinars and seminar series. So I'm going to hand it over to Chris and Bob.
All right, thanks, Cara. This is Chris Leitz, and I'm going to kick off today's discussion and give everyone on the call an overview of the NIST Cybersecurity Framework. Then I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Bob, and he's going to talk about implementing the framework in your enterprise. And then we're going to wrap up with some helpful resources and some recommended actions, and hopefully leave adequate time for Q&A. And again, emphasizing what Cara said earlier, please use that chat box. That'll make it more interesting and I think helpful for everybody in the group. So let me dive into the cybersecurity framework overview. And I'm going to make a few assumptions here at the start of this to try to speed things along. You see, most cyber presentations begin with what we often know as scary bedtime stories, the latest breach statistics from various surveys, the most recent headline, essentially public domain accounts of the latest threat, breach, financial settlement, or an earlier hack. In this presentation, I'm going to save us that time, skip those stories, and assume that you're here and your organization already believe that the cyber threats to your enterprise are real and that you're seeking to manage that risk. You probably recognize that you can't completely avoid it, and you're now to this state of belief that you're trying to manage risk to your business just like you would any other risk, and that is through administrative and technical controls, perhaps transfer it via cyber insurance, or perhaps even you work with your business to make the conscious decision to accept that risk and get on with business. Further, I think I'll assume that you've concluded that cyber isn't just a technology issue. Instead, it's an enterprise-wide issue. It's not something just for the tech team or the CISO to worry about. It's not something that can be handled by even the very, very best PCI program, because that, of course, is limited in scope to the cardholder data environment. And perhaps it's something, and perhaps you're here and thinking about cyber because you're anticipating, like many of us are, that the issue of cybersecurity is going to get more visibility and priority because the legislators, the public domain, and regulators are inching closer and closer to getting more involved in the topic. And then lastly, I'm hoping that everybody is participating today because you're looking for a place to start or organize a full-fledged cybersecurity program that helps you get stakeholders of your enterprise aligned, get your priorities set, and importantly, get the budget you need, and put a plan in place to get risk under what I'll call sufficient control. And again, the premise isn't that we're not going to completely eliminate risk, we're going to get it under control. And if those assumptions are true, and I think they largely are, then I have very good news for you. There's a free resource that you can use to guide your efforts, and that is the NIST Cybersecurity Framework. But first, before we start talking about the framework, I think a little history will set the stage. In 2013, the executive branch took note of widespread cyber intrusions, certainly in the power grid and the public domain, and called for action to mitigate and protect the nation against that risk, and issued something called Executive Order 13636. That EO, as the executive function of our government does, triggers various actions for various government agencies, notable among them the Department of Justice, the Department of Homeland Security, Department of Commerce, and within Commerce, the NIST organization, the National Institute for Standards and Technology. 1 year later, NIST, through a lot of work, a lot of public input and a lot of expertise from both the government as well as the private sector, they issued version 1 of that framework. And again, that was released in February of 2014. As an aside, earlier this year in 2017, a draft version was updated. You can go look at that too and see the changes to it. And that's soon going to go beyond draft version to a published version. Since 2014, the cybersecurity framework has been widely discussed and referenced in the cybersecurity community. And I think many people are aware that the current administration has really doubled down on it. They've issued another executive order. They're putting a little teeth in it for federal agencies, basically mandating that federal agencies will adopt the framework for their programs and report against it. So I'm going to go out on a limb, and I think it's a safe and strong limb, and assert that the NIST cybersecurity framework is here to stay. I'm also going to say that it's getting better and more useful, and that it just might become the framework that is referenced in emerging legislation and regulation. And while I'm out there on that limb, I do want to clear up a misconception that I think has troubled a lot of first-time readers. Don't let the term critical infrastructure lead you to the conclusion that it doesn't apply to you because you're a retailer, a distributed, or a service provider serving the fuel and petroleum retailing industry. The EO, the executive order, defines the term critical infrastructure very broadly. And let me quote this so you can see what I mean. It says systems and assets, either physical or virtual, or vital to the United States, in that the incapacity or destruction of such systems and assets would have a debilitating impact on security, national economic security, national public health or safety, or any combination of those matters. So by that definition, I think it's safe to assume that an ambitious legislator or regulator or anybody could classify a lot of businesses and enterprises, even private sector enterprises, as critical infrastructure. And that's actually good news. I've in the Conexxus community and on the Data Security Committee, I've heard Gray and others talk frequently about the critical role that the convenience store industry plays in protecting, feeding, and keeping our nation connected. And so I think I'm going to proceed under the assumption that we're all part of the critical infrastructure of the United States. So with that, let me go to the framework. What did NIST come up with? But to do that, I'm going to first offer a few comments about what it's not. It is not, and I repeat, it is not another set of security standards. And further, it's not a law, and there's no regulators that are mandating it right now, and there's no auditors standing at the ready to check boxes and measure your readiness for it. Again, you do not have to comply with the cybersecurity framework. It is there for your use. And that's why I think we're presenting it here today, is because most organizations, and I think most people in the cybersecurity community agree, that enterprises would benefit from adopting the cybersecurity framework as a way to make it real, to operationalize a risk-based approach to talking about, funding, and implementing a cybersecurity program at your enterprise. And again, not one that's crammed down your throat, but one that is part of doing business and has evaluated and managed in the context of your business. The picture you see on this slide is taken directly from the NIST document, and it's there for a reason. The big idea is really pretty simple. Via the framework, it starts there. There's 3 interconnected levels here. Executives at the top name the risks they're most concerned about. Business leaders set priorities about managing those risks, and security teams implement and manage controls in accordance with management policy. And the whole idea here is connectedness from policy, operations, and security. So let me extend that and make it a little more real by talking about linking it to PCI compliance. I know many people on this call, my own company, myself, we spend a lot of time talking about and managing PCI compliance. We do this because we have to honor the contractual commitments associated with our processing agreements, and we're doing that to reduce the risk of suffering a card data breach. True, that's a real risk to many businesses, and yet I think we all know that there's a lot of other risks out there that need to be managed. Things like loyalty programs, back office systems, human resource systems, communications networks, emails, mobile devices, and so forth. And so what we're trying to do here with the cybersecurity framework is put all of those threats and risks in context with each other, and rationally and wisely allocate our resources. Okay, and so to adopt the framework, as again we're strongly recommending here, let me give you a preview of it, and then Bob will take it to another level and talk about how to use it. The framework core, it has four main components. The framework core is perhaps the one that people gravitate to and see because it's familiar. It's a business language summarization of what we're trying to accomplish in a cybersecurity program, and it has these 5 functions, color-coded to help us remember them. And those 5 functions are identify, and in the identify, we're trying to identify what matters most to the business. Protect, those things that matter. Detect, when bad things happen. Respond to those bad things, and recover and get things back in order after the fact. Okay, so that's the framework core. Again, a business language summarization of the outcomes we're seeking to drive. The implementation tiers is a way of gauging your progress, and it gives management this mechanism to evaluate themselves. And again, note to the PCI people out there, it's not a pass-fail test, it's not a yes-no answer. Implementation tiers are subjective evaluations and statement of policy and management intent. So let me offer an illustration from something that's probably familiar to all of us. I said earlier that the framework can be applied to any enterprise, certainly a petroleum retailer, certainly a distributor. I think all of service providers that serve our industry, but I'm going to make it even more simple. Let's talk about it if it's a home. If I was trying to protect my home, I'd probably try to do all of these 5 things. I would first identify the valuable things that I have. I would put controls or protective controls in place to keep people from accessing them, viewing them, stealing them. I would want to monitor what I have and put alarms in place. I would also want to know who to call when those alarms go off, and I'd want to be able to restore what I've lost after the fact. Okay, simple example. Let me translate that into cybersecurity language. And so this is probably going to start to look familiar to the security people on the call. Again, 5 core functions here: identify, protect, detect, respond, recover. And then they're broke. What you see in the bullet points there are the categories, and each function is broken into multiple categories, and then they're further subdivided into subcategories, and I'm going to show an example of that in a minute. But one thing I do want to highlight is that there is, in version 1.1, a new supply chain management category, and I think that's one of perhaps the most material and most helpful improvement of version 1.1 is that NIST has recognized that all of our businesses are interconnected to each other, and so that you can't really manage security of your enterprise if you're not also managing the security of the products you buy, the service providers you work with, and whatnot. And so it provides a place and a home for vendor inventories, asset inventories, and things like that under the broad label of supply chain risk management. Okay, let me keep breaking it down a little bit so everybody gets a sense of this. This is one of the functions. This is one of the functions, or one category, access control, and 2 of the access control subcategories of the protect function. I hope that's pretty straightforward, business language again, and what we're trying to do is communicate what we're trying to accomplish, our outcomes, in business language. And from there, we can go do what security people like to do, and that is select, develop, and implement controls. And and importantly, when you move to the right of this table, and there's pages upon pages of these in the document itself, NIST has provided cross-references to industry standards and has intentionally not restated them, rewritten them, raised a competitor at anything that's already out there. Now, true, NIST does author and maintain one of the things you see there on the right, the 853 standard, which is shown here as Rev 4, but actually Rev 5 was just released recently. But and so NIST, as part of a separate function, does maintain that. And you can use that, but importantly, you can also use really any control family or function that you want that's right for your business, whether it be from the Council of Cybersecurity, from ISACA's COBIT, from the International Society of Automation, or from ISO, the International Organization for Standardization. And I hope and I believe that that's a relief for security teams everywhere. All of us get to choose the framework that works best, and perhaps even the one you're already using. The one that's not on that list is PCI, and in my opinion, that's there intentionally because, of course, PCI is a private thing and it's out there and it serves its function, but it's not a enterprise-wide framework. It's it has a specific purpose and a specific place in a security program, but it's not a standard for enterprise security, and thus it's not listed here. Okay, so implementation tiers. This is really the last thing I want to leave you with from a preview standpoint. This is, again, what I talked about as a subjective evaluation, management speak for how the enterprise is viewing cybersecurity. And what NIST is encouraging is organizations to rate themselves in terms of implementation tiers. And that is, where are we at? Where are we at today? And what is our essential policy around cyber risk management? And let me quote this again because I think the language is helpful. It says, NIST recommends that the implementation tiers be used, and quote, to provide context on how an organization views cybersecurity risk and the process in place to manage that risk. So, they lay out these 4 tiers. I think everyone's free to rename them as they want. You can use these 4 or whatever's appropriate, but the 4 they suggest are partial, risk-informed, repeatable, and adaptive, and that's an increasing level of sophistication from 1 to 4. Those provide, and then they've written in some guidelines for how you might want to rate yourself across those, and they break that rating down into 3 dimensions. They're asking you to evaluate your risk management process, the integrated risk management program, external participation, and that is the participation for management, people outside of security. And then in version 1.1, there's actually a 4th dimension that's not listed on this slide. That's the supply chain risk management. So when we get to a final version 1.1, we'll probably be updating that, and it'll give teams a helpful way of rating themselves via these implementation tiers, which again is shorthand, a quick summary, if you would, of management's perception of risk preparedness and intent. And I think we're going to find that implementation tiers are useful to communicate with shareholders, the board of directors, employees, even customers and suppliers. And management can declare where they think they're currently at in terms of cyber risk management and where they're going. Okay, so with that, I've provided you a quick overview of what I think is about a 60-page document out there. But Bob's going to talk. I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Bob, and he's going to talk about making it real.
All right, thanks, Chris. So, as you can tell from Chris's discussion, CoFi is a true believer and a proponent of this framework. We use it frequently to guide our work in assessing clients' cybersecurity programs and helping other clients stand up programs if they are just starting to think about cybersecurity. We find it's very flexible, a powerful tool that meets the needs of organizations of any size or industry sector. And while it's not mandatory, as Chris pointed out, it gets a lot of positive attention from the various regulatory bodies, to include Securities and Exchange Commission if you're a publicly held company. The cyber risk insurance industry talks a lot about it in their conferences and seminars and things on that line. And it's also serving as a model for state regulators. If you took a look at the New York State Department of Financial Services regulation that came out this year, you'll see a lot of that is based on the cybersecurity framework. So the following slides, I'll walk you through the NIST implementation guidance, and I'll add in some commentary that we at Coalfire have learned from lessons learned across multiple client engagements. So if we take a look at this slide, one of the great features of the NIST framework is that it actually gives you some implementation guidance. There's 7 implementation steps, and you'll find that in section 3.2. Titled Establishing or Improving a Cybersecurity Program. And while the graphic here is linear, let's not forget that this is a continuous process. There's changes in business models, regulatory environments, technology advances, all combined with each other to make cybersecurity pretty much a continuous process. So we always need to keep that in mind, that the job is never done. So Chris, if we could move to the next slide. So let's start our journey at the beginning. It's a good idea to know where you're going. So step 1 consists of prioritizing and scoping what aspect of the business you're looking at. And as Chris pointed out in this diagram earlier, you have an enterprise level, you have a business level, and then you have a system level. For most clients that I work with, I recommend starting at the enterprise level as a first step, and then you work your way down to the subsequent levels in follow-on projects. And the reason I do that is that you've heard the expression tone at the top, okay? By starting at the enterprise level, you help get an understanding as to, do you have a solid risk management strategy, and what's your governance structure? And these are all part of the identify functions. And it's going to have a significant impact on how the lower levels, the business process and the system level risk assessments and security programs approach cybersecurity and following out their responsibilities. So Chris, if we could have the next slide, please. So building on that, we come to step 2, and this is where we get some additional framing and context to guide the work. And we take a look at what key business processes and functions are essential for the organization to achieve its goal. As Chris pointed out, you spend a lot of time focusing on PCI and the payment card industry data security standards and guarding that cardholder data. Well, what we take a look at is we take a look at the entire enterprise. For instance, what are the systems supporting your closed circuit TV? What are the systems supporting your pump operations? Things along that line. If your systems went down, what would happen to the payment card? How does it impact the business? How does it impact your ability to generate revenue for your company? So we take a look at what the legal, regulatory, contractual requirements are that affect the enterprise. As we said, most of you are familiar with the PCI standards, but what about other requirements? Well, if you're carrying HR systems and you have information on your employees, that's covered by about 50 different state data breach laws. And that has absolutely nothing to do with payment card. You might also have strategy documents, intellectual property that needs to be protected, your financial systems not related to the credit card environment, are all of the business processes that rely on IT and the cybersecurity surrounding those functions. And then you also have some other requirements. There might be requirements from, if you're a publicly held company, as I pointed out, the Securities and Exchange Commission has a lot of disclosure guidance out there right now relative to cybersecurity incidents, whether or not it has an impact, material impact on the business and what needs to be reported. And that's all very important when you start looking into your incident response function. It comes down to who must be notified. How do you go about doing that? I work with a lot of mid-sized companies that do a lot of outsourcing of their IT systems. And when I first go in there, they have the belief that their IT service provider is going to handle their incident response. And that's partially correct generally. But then you start talking about, well, Is your IT service provider going to formulate the strategy and the communications to the Securities and Exchange Commission or state regulators in the event of a data breach? And they say, no, we don't want them to do that. And I says, well, this is why you, in addition to their incident response plan, need to start thinking about that. And then finally, you might actually have some data from trading partners, companies that you do business with. They can B2B or business-to-business enterprises, in which case, they might actually have contractual requirements that you need to protect their data, or they want to know how you're going to continue to provide critical services to them as they go about their business. So these are all context that goes into the legal, regulatory, and contractual environment. And then finally, we take a look at, has the risk strategy been developed and implemented? And that's where we actually take a hard look at, because if you look at those implementation tiers that Chris was talking about earlier, 50% of that is all about risk. So Chris, if we could move on to the next slide, please.
Got it.
Okay, thanks. So once we have an idea as to what we're going to take a look at, we go out and we create a current profile. As you can see here, you've got the 5 functions, and the categories is over 20 categories and probably over 100 subcategories. And these are all groups of outcomes, for instance, asset management or access control. And the subcategories, if you go back to Chris's slide, they get very specific. And those are specific outcomes that you're looking at. And these are things that, a cybersecurity program should take a look at. But, since this is not mandatory, you have to consider that this is a voluntary framework. And a lot of this has to go into how senior management and the board of directors take a look at risk and how they frame risk and establish risk context. And when we take a look at the activities, the categories, and the subcategories, they could be, what we do is we give them an assessment as to whether or not they're fully implemented, partially implemented, are they planned for the future, or not implemented, or maybe they're not even applicable. Again, it's a very flexible framework, unlike some of the more other frameworks that are very compliance driven. This is really designed to help you establish or improve your total cybersecurity program. And Chris, if we could move on to the next slide, please. So the most important thing that we take a look at now is the risk. It's core to any viable cybersecurity program. How senior management identifies, frames, assesses, manages, and monitors risk really should drive the cybersecurity program. And we have a firm belief that this is a senior management function. Okay, the chief information security officer should not be determining what the organization's tolerance from risk is going to be. That's a losing proposition. Your technology staff should not be determining what is a material or a major high impact risk to the business. It's not their business at all. They can inform management of vulnerabilities. They can inform management of threats, but it's going to be senior management at the end of the day that's going to determine what level of risk tolerance a particular organization has. And only they can establish that. And then once that's established, that guides everything else. Okay. If a good risk management strategy is going to set up what the level of tolerance is, it's going to establish some processes as to how this risk is going to be monitored, how it's going to be transferred, how it's going to be mitigated. Or, the decision might be we're just not going to accept the risk at all, and we're going to avoid a certain activity. So there's many methodologies out there and techniques to assess risk. You need to find one that's appropriate to your organization's size, industry, and the culture. Culture is very big on risk management. But whatever framework you use, whatever technique you use, one thing that you really need to focus on is what's called the crown jewels. And those are the things that are truly critical to the business. What business processes are out there that are essential to your organization's achieving its business objectives? What drives revenue? How do you serve customers and things along that line? You need to know what those crown jewels are. And the crown jewels are going to consist of those IT assets, whether it's data, whether it's systems, whether it's applications that support those critical business processes. You need to know where they are, what they are and how they contribute to the business and how they actually are used. So if you take a look at this slide, this is a very notional slide on risk assessment. We've taken and broken it down into 4 risk areas: legal and regulatory, and productivity, financial stability, and reputation risk, and loss of customer confidence. And we've taken a look at high, medium, and low. This is what you would call a qualitative risk assessment versus a quantitative risk assessment. But it's a good place to take a start. You know, you take a look at, in the legal and regulatory area, for instance, if you handle a lot of personally identifiable information, if you're handling personal health information as defined by the laws and regulations of where the company conducts operations and where its employees are, you know, that's going to be a high risk. If for some reason or other, and I really don't see this as a viable situation, if the company doesn't handle personal data other than those people employed by the organization, it's a lower risk. So this is how you would go through and take a look at things. As I said, it's a notional one. It's just one of many. With that, Chris, if we could move on to the next slide.
Sure.
So now in this step, we create a target profile. And what we do is we take the current profile that you had established earlier as to what you were doing today. We take a look at the risk assessment that was conducted and the risk to the business, and see if the current status, if your current profile, if the functions and the activities that you're doing today really align tightly with the risk that your organization has identified and wants to manage. And if it doesn't, then you take a look at what your target profile is. How can you better manage that risk? You know, are there more actions that you can do, say, for instance, in the identify function or the protect function? A lot of companies that we go into, as I said earlier, they need to do some work on the respond functions, because as we all know now in this day and age, it's not a matter of if you get attacked, it's going to be a matter of when, and how you respond and how you're able to recover from those incidents is very critical. So with that, you take a look at where do you want to go to improve your security posture. And again, this is informed specifically by the risk assessment. And one of the great things about doing the risk assessment is that you can target higher risk areas for special attention. I mean, once you know what the crown jewels are, once you know what the senior management and level of tolerance is for risk within the organization, you can adjust things to address those areas of higher risk, as opposed to putting things, you know, equally across the board. A lot of times when you go in and you find an organization that's basically doing a controls-based assessment, they put controls on everything, and sometimes that leads to maybe over-investing in one area that might not have a higher enough risk, and under-investing in other areas where it's really high risk, and you probably should spend some more time and attention and resources to reduce the potential impact. So we want to make sure that you can establish a cybersecurity program that really buys down the risk that you need to buy down, and not just spend money and resources and time equally across the board. Chris, if we could move on to the next slide, please. Thank you. And of course, now when based on our target profile and where we are, we're always going to know that we have gaps, right? It's very seldom are we going to find out that we're going to do everything perfectly. And our target profile miraculously looks exactly like our current profile, and we can call it a day and go home. There's going to be some gaps there. So what we do is we take a look at the current state versus the target state where we want to go, and we take a look at the gaps that are around there. And again, any number of ways to do that. One of the techniques that we would use is we combine a maturity value versus an implementation guide. Now, do not confuse this with the implementation tiers. Okay, the implementation tiers are not a maturity level. They are just implementation tiers as to where you would want to go and how you would address risk. What we do here is we take a look at the controls, and we might find that, you know, out of the X number of categories, the 6 categories within asset management, you're somewhat lacking, or the organization is lacking in 3 of them. Okay, and we start taking a look at, well, how does this buy down risk and where do we want to go there? And we give that a scoring. So, and one of the things that we also look at is to not get hung up on this maturity level, because you could be relatively immature in one area and you could live with that, you could survive that, but you really need to put some assets and resources and attention focused on another function to buy that risk down. So we're not looking to game the system and get all of our maturity rankings up there and grab the low-hanging fruit just so that we can play with the scores and things along that line. What we really want to do is we look at to significantly reduce cybersecurity risk within the organization. And if that means that a certain area is going to remain at a relatively immature level for a period of time while we're focusing on a higher risk area, that's the right thing to do. You should feel okay about doing that. And if we could move on to the next slide, please, Chris. And then finally, it's step 7 here. It's implement the action plan. Now, as I repeatedly said here, the goal is to reduce as much risk as you can, but you got to understand, as we all know, that in my world, I'm sure it's the same in your world, budgets are finite. We don't have enough resources, whether it's staff, whether it's money, to get everything done at once. So what we tend to do is we take a look at what can we do for quick wins, and quick wins are important because what you'll find is that gets some positive press going on your program. You're demonstrating value to the business, and you're showing some immediate impact. And then you take a look at, well, what are the near-term things that we can do? Again, how do we buy down the risk with the resources and the constraints that we have available? And, in this illustration, we're doing certain things. It could be totally different in another organization. And this might be something that's done in the near term, and depending upon budget cycles, it could be this year's budget cycle, or it could be next year. And then we take a look at what's going on long term. And the long term is where we really start getting a little iffy. Because as we know, things change, right? You could wake up the next morning and find out that your company has decided that we're going to go into an e-commerce strategy, or we're going to change our loyalty programs, or we've decided to go mobile. So this is that change in business model. It's going to have a large impact on your security program. Or it could be something along the line of there's new threats out there. You've raised the attention, you've become a high enough profile target for a criminal enterprise or a hacktivist group or something along that line that's changed the threat picture. Or you might have introduced some new technology in response to competitive pressures, in response to reducing labor costs. We're going to introduce some automation and things like that. So in the long term, you always have to keep an eye out that that's subject to change. But you want to get it on there, and you want to keep on adapting your program to meet the needs of the business. And that's one of the strongest things that we can, you can't emphasize enough, is that the cybersecurity program is there to support the business. It's not there to support cybersecurity, even though we all like to believe that security is good for security's sake. In the end of the day, it needs to support the business goals and objectives. So that's where we are as far as the long-term planning. And with that, I'll turn it over to Chris to talk about some resources and some recommended actions.
Yeah, so now we're at that so what stage. We've put out a lot of information about we've given you an overview of the cybersecurity framework. We've walked through a process, the steps that NIST recommends, and hopefully the color commentary that Bob's provided is helpful and help you visualize how it might work in your business. But let me leave you with some resources here. And again, shout out to the thoughts survey at the end. And when you do that, you'll get these slides, and you don't have to write these down. They will be in the slides and shared with you. But I want to call out these 6 things here in particular. I mentioned earlier that the cybersecurity framework is well, I guess nothing's free because our tax dollars paid for it, but it is now free to everybody. Go get it. It's out there. You can look at either the old version or the new draft version, version 1.1, but it is there for download. Turn it into PDF, save it, start reading it. I think you'll find it familiar and hopefully consistent with what we've talked about here today. Another organization that I think a lot of us are a member of and have participated with over the years is ISACA. They've done a lot of work to align their own COBIT model with the cybersecurity framework. So I think they're seeing tons of consistency. They don't see it as they see it as a business language translation of the materials they maintain. So they've got a lot of materials out there again for your use, and find the ISAC member in your organization to go get it. Couple other things. There are some industries that are ahead of others. Financial services industry is one of them. And the FFIEC is a cross-agency assurance organization that indicates that sets standards and assessment guidelines for various financial services firms, and they have created something called the Cybersecurity Assessment Tool. So I think you can see in financial services that the assessment is coming. There's great alignment between the way banking and financial services is going to measure cybersecurity. So I think I would characterize the financial services as an early adopter of the framework in concept, and perhaps as a harbinger of what's about to come for should the government and regulators get involved in all industries. So I think that's worth everybody having some knowledge of. And then out there in the information security and risk community, I mentioned the NIST publications. 830 is about risk. 853 I mentioned earlier is really, I think NIST likes to think of it as the world's best controls catalog. Again, there's a new version, Rev 5 is out there now in draft and is going to go final here shortly. Mentioned COBIT 5, of course, and then of course the ISO standards for people who see an advantage in harmonizing with the international standards. ISO is out there. One other organization that belongs on this list is the Center for Internet Security, the critical controls, sometimes called the SANS 20 list. That's another way of looking at a controls catalog. And again, cross-references are provided from the framework to that controls catalog. So again, you're going to need controls. You can get them from a variety of places, and the cybersecurity framework is not specific on that. I want to also point out the NACD, that's the National Association of Corporate Directors. They have gotten quite serious about the topic of cyber risk. Cyber risk oversight is now one of those SEC and director level concerns, and so they've been training up and publishing guidelines on that. Coalfire has done a variety of projects supporting audit committees and management teams on the topic, and this handbook is a great guideline, again, business language summary of how to oversee and manage cyber risk. And I think for those of us that are charged with briefing boards and presenting assessments and recommendations to top management, if we spend a little time with the NACD material, we'll understand how our presentations have to be developed and presented and communicated. And then lastly, Bob went to, I think, great lengths to talk about the importance of risk assessment. There's a couple of things out there and that'll help us wrestle with one of those long-standing questions of how do we measure risk? What alternatives are out there? There is an emerging quantitative framework out there, the FAIR approach, that I think is gaining a certain amount of traction, particularly as people try to figure out how to price cyber insurance and how much insurance to buy and how much risk they're exposed to and trying to quantify it. FAIR proposes a model for that. And Doug Hubbard, the How to Measure Anything guy, has actually taken a great run at cybersecurity risk. And again, that's a book that's on many of our bookshelves and potentially helpful to those of us that are trying to architect programs and measure cyber risk. Okay, so where do you go? So what? What do you do? I guess what we would recommend as practitioners in the space is that everybody should review and consider adopting the NIST cybersecurity framework for their business. And before diving in too far, though, make sure that you've got a team. And that is, get a governance process in place, and that top management support, a charter, statement of policy, intent, set the scope, things like that. So none of this stuff is starts from the bottom. It definitely tone at the top, as Bob mentioned earlier, is key. And then we want to go through those 7 steps that Bob walked out, and I've re-paraphrased them here. Figure out, you don't have to start with the whole enterprise. You can start with a department or a location. You got to name the crown jewels, figure out where you're at, evaluate the likelihood and potential impact to risk, figure out where you want to be to get the risk to an acceptable and agreed upon level, lay out an action plan, implement, and then wash, rinse, and repeat. So again, this is what NIST has created is a roadmap that I think is highly helpful, highly adaptable, certainly customizable, and it'll take us from the gotta do it world of compliance-oriented programs to should do it, have the full power and support of management to implement it, to that sort of a paradigm in terms of our cybersecurity programs. So that's all of our prepared remarks. Kara or others, do you want to kind of guide the Q&A session?
Sure. Thanks again, gentlemen. You've shared a lot of great information today. We do have a couple questions and comments that have come through. First, what tools do you recommend for measuring effectiveness of the technical controls for the cybersecurity framework? I guess, the comment along with that is that Tenable claims that 90% of technical controls can be automated and measured. But do you have any recommendations for tools to measure that effectiveness of that CSF?
Chris, you want me to take that one? There's really no technical controls listed in the cybersecurity framework. They do have in there that they take a look at the technologies that are out there relative to access control and how do you detect incidents and things like that, but there's really no technical controls per se listed there. So I would say that for any cybersecurity program that you have out there, if there's technology is involved, and one of the things that we would recommend is, are you doing any kind of penetration testing? Can your detection systems, your endpoints picking up what's going on in the system, things along that line. But there are a number of fine tools out there. I know we're not supposed to get into vendor-specific tools, but there are any number of vulnerability scanning programs out there. There's pen testing tools and firms that conduct those services, and so on. And Chris, if you wanted to add on to anything with that, that's fine.
I would. I think we got to be careful about the question and exactly what is implied by the question. I think the attendee wrote measuring the effectiveness of a technical control. So let me kind of pick at that a little bit. I think it's super easy to implement a tool and have measurement, right? All tools, let's pick on vulnerability scanning, for example, right? Lots of vulnerabilities. We're all familiar with those. We've all seen those scan reports. I mean, that's measurement. How about measure now? But the question is measure the effectiveness of those. Well, and there I think you can't ask your scan vendor to measure the effectiveness, right? That's a business decision. And I think the same would be true for every technical control, your logging system, your alerting system, right? Like was a particular event detected? Was a piece of malware detected? Was it effective? Well, effectiveness would be malicious malware. Did it get through or did it not? Or did it go through the screening process? Like you got to evaluate it in that way. And so that the tools need to be tuned by the professionals to the effectiveness that is intended by the design and implementation of the
Is there, I think we're okay, the attendee says, okay. So then we do have another comment, and referencing slide 19 particularly, and I guess the comment is that really PCI is the only industry regulatory data security standard that has enforcement and real penalties for non-compliance. How do you dovetail that into getting your upper management's buy-off and get that to resonate throughout the company so that we can be as effective with this as we are with PCI? it's easy to go to your upper management and say, we have to do this if we want to accept payment cards. So,
Yep.
you know,
Yeah.
so
well, that right there,
let
me just jump in and say, PCI compliance is one of the risks to a business that a business must manage. So I am not at all, discounting or eliminating or removing PCI. Being able to process cards and avoiding the fines and penalties of doing it in an unsafe manner or being in a non-compliant manner, that is one of the many risks. And so I think most enterprises are going to appropriately fund and budget their PCI programs so as to avoid those fines and penalties and the enforcement from the processors and the card brands. That's table stakes, I think. And so, it's a more mature system, and it's kind of mandatory because it's in everybody's contract. So yeah, that is absolutely one of the compliance mandates that must be managed, part of the cybersecurity program, no problem. I think the thing we've labored under as an industry is we struggled with what's the proper priority, the proper funding. Does that suck all the dollars away from everything else? And I don't want to go too deep in this rabbit hole, but we've had many clients at Coalfire that have had compliant, repeatable PCI programs, but had a awakening where they realized that their financial systems weren't anywhere near as secure as their payment systems, or they had great exposure to employee data, or they had far greater exposure to other aspects, and they were largely and they hadn't funded those aspects of their program anywhere near adequately. So, I think what we're advocating and what the cybersecurity framework should do is help you voluntarily allocate budgets based on risk. And yes, PCI risk is part of that.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, one attendee chimed in here and just said, cybersecurity framework does support PCI, so you can find a few documents on that, and then obviously you can take some of this framework and dig into the gap that's already been evaluated. So thanks again for the comments from the attendees, because as they also comment, is I think everybody knows on this call, PCI doesn't cover everything, as you just alluded to. So we do have another question, and that is that the FTC references PCI DSS as the definition of the standard in lawsuits that they regularly win, yet we're told it is optional. It sure doesn't sound optional. So the attendee would like to know what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah. Bobby, you want to start, or do you want?
Sorry,
I'm happy to chime in as well.
I'm just trying to unpack the question there, is that the framework, a lot of what comes out about the framework will make it sound mandatory. There's regulatory agencies out there that basically they like the framework, they support the framework, and even though they say it's not mandatory, an agency could make it specific. So for instance, Chris, you just talked about the latest presidential directive that mandated that federal agencies will use the framework. So from that perspective, the framework is a mandatory type thing, but the actual framework itself, as issued by NIST, is not mandatory.
Yeah, and some of the, I'd add that some of the legal actions speak to management responsibility and negligence and commonly accepted best practices and whatnot. And again, I don't think the FTC is, they get involved when in cases where legal claims are made or where misrepresentations are made. And like, for example, there's been a few cases. I think Dwala was one, or maybe that's a different agency. But the point is, if you misrepresent something or do something that is wholly inappropriate, then the agencies can in fact come at you, and they will use the framework as a reference in their arguments. But again, they haven't created an enforcement mechanism and a compliance regime to drive that. Now that could come to pass. I think Bob says, I think the federal government agencies are probably going to need to demonstrate compliance, and it could happen in the world of retail and in the supply chain that serves retail. So I think we're all anticipating that some due diligence process is going to emerge in the coming weeks and months.
To build on that, Chris, is when the regulatory agencies go out looking for evidence of a cybersecurity program, a question will come up as to what framework or methodology do you use to guide your security program. Right now, the NIST Cybersecurity framework is one of those that can be used to demonstrate that, yes, we have these processes, we go through this, and we adhere to this, and here's our plan, is how we do it. And that gives you a certain amount of protection. You could just as easily use ISO or some of the other frameworks out there too. But right now, because it was developed by the U.S. government, people tend to use cybersecurity framework quite a bit.
Great. Great. You know, a couple of the comments here, and then we'll wrap up. But you know, there's a few things within PCI that you can choose to implement the way that you want based on what's feasible for the business, such as, you know, do you change your password every 90 days? But, you know, does it make sense to change it every 30 or 60 days depending on the sensitivity? So we certainly understand that. So, and thanks again for everybody attending today. And if you do have further questions, please send them to info@conexxus.org. And again, we encourage everybody to answer the couple questions, survey questions following this Conexxus webinar, and to get the copy of the slide deck. So thanks everybody for attending today, and Bob and Chris, thank you so much for sharing all that great knowledge today. Have a good day, everybody.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye.